Yahweh, the so-called God of the Old Testament, wasn't a divine spirit watching over humanity. He was flesh and blood. He walked, he talked, he burned, he demanded, he punished. That's not the behavior of an all-loving, omnipotent creator. That's the profile of a ruler, a being of power, ego, and control. You've been worshipping a king who came from the sky, not the infinite source of existence. And once you start seeing the text through that lens, everything changes. Every command, every punishment, every sacrifice starts looking like what it really is, the rulebook of an ancient overlord. Let's be clear, this isn't about faith. This is about power. Yahweh acts exactly like the Anunnaki described in the oldest Mesopotamian tablets, those sky beings who descended to earth, built humans to serve them, and then crowned themselves gods. They weren't metaphorical. They were tangible. They mined, they built, they fought. And Yahweh fits their pattern like a glove, a jealous, possessive entity obsessed with obedience and sacrifice. He didn't create man out of love. He manufactured a workforce and branded himself as God so his subjects would never question their chains. Why does a perfect being need constant worship? Why demand offerings, blood, burnt meat, temples? Why threaten plagues and fire on those who disobey? That's not enlightenment, that's management. It's the psychology of a ruler maintaining dominance through fear. The so-called covenant wasn't a spiritual pact, it was a contract. Serve me, obey my rules, and I'll keep you alive. Step out of line, and I'll erase you. That's not divinity. That's dictatorship on a cosmic scale. Now look at the language of those ancient texts. Yahweh comes down in smoke, in thunder, in light. He walks in the garden. He descends from a mountain. He rides a chariot of fire. These are physical descriptions. You're not reading about an invisible God, you're reading about a being with technology. A being whose power looked divine to Bronze Age humans who couldn't tell the difference between a spacecraft and a flaming chariot. And what's worse? This being claimed exclusivity. You shall have no other gods before me. That's not the voice of the source. That's a conqueror warning his subjects not to defect. The Anunnaki story mirrors this perfectly. In Sumerian accounts, these sky beings split into factions, those who wanted to guide humanity and those who wanted to control it. Yahweh falls squarely into the latter. The jealous God. The Punisher. The one who floods, smites, curses, tests, and destroys. That's not benevolence, it's ownership. And ownership requires submission. That's why fear of God is written as the foundation of wisdom. Not love. Not freedom. Fear. People forget that Yahweh wasn't the only God worshipped in ancient Israel. There were others, El, Baal, Asherah. The land was filled with rival deities. But somewhere along the line, one faction seized control and erased the rest. Yahweh's cult became the only legal one, and every other god was rebranded as false, evil, or demonic. That's how monopolies work, you eliminate the competition. And through that erasure, monotheism was born. But behind that word hides the same old truth, the most ruthless ruler always wins. Let's take a step back and analyze the behavior pattern. The Anunnaki ruled humanity through a system of dependence. They gave knowledge selectively. They taught agriculture, metalwork, astronomy, but only what was necessary for humans to be productive. Sound familiar? In the Yahweh narrative, the tree of knowledge is forbidden. Human curiosity is punished. Disobedience equals exile. That's not morality. That's control of information. A being that fears human enlightenment isn't divine, it's insecure. Because the moment you learn, you become unpredictable. And unpredictable workers don't stay slaves for long. And when humanity began multiplying, Yahweh's reaction wasn't joy, it was irritation. My spirit shall not abide in man forever, for he is flesh. That's not the voice of a loving creator, it's the complaint of a genetic engineer realizing his experiment got out of hand. So he floods the earth, resets the system, and starts again with a handful of survivors loyal to him. That's not salvation. That's population control. The flood narrative isn't a moral lesson, it's a cover-up of mass eradication. Just like the Anunnaki tablets describe when the gods wiped out noisy humans disturbing their peace. Ask yourself, why is Yahweh obsessed with blood? Blood on the altar. Blood on the doorpost. Blood in the covenant. Because blood is energy. Every ritual, every sacrifice was an energy transaction disguised as worship. The Anunnaki were said to absorb the life essence of offerings. Ancient temples weren't built for prayer, they were built as energy conduits. Humanity was the power source. Religion was the circuit. And Yahweh was the system administrator, feeding off obedience and fear to sustain his reign. Every act of divine wrath in Scripture follows the same pattern: disobedience, punishment, submission, restoration. It's behavioral conditioning. The same method trainers use on animals: reward compliance, punish rebellion. The only difference? Here, the stakes are cosmic. You either worship or you die. And the brilliance of the system is that it programs you to call your submission faith. You enslave yourself and call it salvation. And don't forget the obsession with chosen people. Why would an infinite, all-powerful creator have favorites? Why play politics with tribes? Because this isn't about love, it's about territory. Each Anunnaki faction ruled a region, built its own followers, and waged proxy wars through them. Yahweh's chosen weren't special, they were his soldiers. Their victories were his victories. Their sacrifices, his sustenance. That's why the Old Testament reads like a military campaign journal, not a spiritual revelation. It's a record of conquest under divine branding. Even the 10 Commandments fit the same pattern: I am the Lord your God who brought you out of slavery. The first line literally frames the relationship as master and servant. The rules aren't for enlightenment, they're for control. The Anunnaki system worked by binding humans with oaths, contracts, and fear. Yahweh institutionalized that system. He didn't liberate his people, he re-enslaved them under divine law. The chains just became invisible. Notice how Yahweh's manifestations always involve thunder, smoke, clouds, and fire, just like descriptions of the Anunnaki crafts descending. The ancients called them chariots of the gods. The Israelites called it the glory of the Lord. Different names, same phenomenon. The mountain trembles, the people fall, and Moses speaks through a glowing face, classic signs of radiation exposure. These aren't metaphors. They are misinterpreted encounters with technology. And if you read carefully, Yahweh isn't omnipresent or omniscient. He moves from place to place. He asks questions. He investigates. He changes his mind. He regrets. Those are traits of a limited being, not a cosmic consciousness. An all-knowing God wouldn't need to come down to see what humans are doing. That's a supervisor checking his field. The evidence is right there, hidden in plain sight for thousands of years. When you strip away the holy language, you're left with a portrait of a powerful, territorial entity who engineered humanity, demanded loyalty, and erased his rivals. That's not spirituality, that's colonialism on a divine scale. The Anunnaki didn't rule with democracy or compassion, they ruled with command and compliance. Yahweh simply perfected the model. And the irony? The slaves never realized they were slaves. They called their master father. Now, imagine being one of those ancient humans. You see fire descend from the sky. You hear a voice through the air. You witness beings walking out of light. How would you describe it? You'd say God spoke. You'd bow. You'd obey. Because you're facing power you can't comprehend. That's how the myth begins, by confusing technology with divinity. The Anunnaki didn't need to pretend forever. Once fear took root, humans carried the control mechanism forward themselves. Religion became self-sustaining. The slaves became the priests. Yahweh's entire story fits the Anunnaki template: arrival from the heavens, genetic engineering of humanity, enforcement of obedience through law and fear, periodic destruction of defiant populations, and constant demand for devotion. The only thing that changed over millennia was the branding. The gods became God. The system remained the same. You've been told Yahweh is the Alpha and the Omega, the Eternal, the Creator of everything. But if you trace the linguistic and mythological DNA, Yahweh shows up late to the party. He's not the origin, he's the adaptation. The echoes of his name, his behavior, his rituals, their fingerprints left by much older gods from Mesopotamia. And when you map it out, the pattern is too precise to ignore. Yahweh didn't appear out of the void. He was built, stitched together from the remains of the Anunnaki pantheon that ruled long before the Hebrew tribes ever spoke his name. Start with the region. We're talking Mesopotamia, the cradle of civilization, the birthplace of writing, law, and organized religion. The Sumerians had the Anunnaki. The Akkadians worshipped Enlil, Enki, Inanna, Nana. The Babylonians inherited them, renamed them, reformatted them. Then the Canaanites, neighbors to early Israel, worshipped El, Baal, and Asherah. Sound familiar? Because that's where Yahweh's mask starts to form. In early texts, Yahweh wasn't alone. He was part of a council. God stands in the assembly of gods. That's straight out of the Psalms. He wasn't the only one yet. He was one among many. But something happened. His cult, small and local, began absorbing and rebranding older deities. A theological hostile takeover. Look at the linguistic trail. The name El was the Canaanite high god, father of all divine beings. Elohim literally means gods, plural. Yet translators morphed it into a singular word for God. That's not divine mystery, that's editorial surgery. Early Israelites worshipped Yahweh alongside others, and inscriptions prove it, ancient altars showing Yahweh and his consort, Asherah. That's right, Yahweh had a wife. The priests later erased her, burned her name out of history, and rewrote the story to make him a lone, jealous deity. That's not revelation, that's revision. They were rewriting the board of divine hierarchy, not discovering it. Now, let's talk about how Yahweh's personality was imported. The traits, jealousy, storms, war, fire, are identical to Baal, the Canaanite storm god. Even the imagery lines up: lightning, thunder, mountains, smoke. Yahweh is Baal under new management. The difference? Baal was one of many. Yahweh decided he'd be the only one. He didn't invent divinity, he monopolized it. And just like any monopoly, it started with a merger, Yahweh absorbing Baal's attributes, El's authority, and the Anunnaki's origin story. What do you get when you merge three gods into one and strip the competition? Monotheism, a rebrand sold as purity but born out of conquest. You've got to understand how power worked back then. Gods weren't abstract, they were national. Every tribe, every city, had its own patron deity. When one nation conquered another, their god was declared superior. That's how Yahweh evolved, from a regional god of storms and war in the deserts of Edom to the supreme deity of a nation after conquest and propaganda fused. That's why early texts describe him coming from Seir or from Teman, that's territory south of Israel, not heaven. He was a southern tribal deity elevated to cosmic authority through centuries of rewriting. And the parallels with the Anunnaki system are too sharp to brush off. The Anunnaki operated through a hierarchy of power, a council of deities led by a dominant ruler, with each god assigned a domain: sky, sea, earth, underworld. Early Yahwism had the same setup. The sons of God, the divine council, the messengers, it's a bureaucratic pantheon under one administrator. The later writers just stripped the ranks and declared all others angels or rebels. That's how you sanitize history. You rename your rivals and call it revelation. The entire idea of Satan as a fallen angel may have been the leftover myth of rival Anunnaki factions who opposed Yahweh's claim to total control. Watch how the mythology shifts over time. The earliest Hebrew traditions mention El Elyon, the Most High, who divided the nations among his sons, each getting a people to rule. Israel, they said, was Yahweh's portion. Translation: Yahweh was assigned a territory. That's administration, not omnipotence. That's the exact same pattern the Anunnaki used. They governed human tribes like property, each deity with their own subjects. Yahweh just ended up with the loudest worshippers and the best propaganda. Here's where it gets darker. The priests who solidified Yahweh's supremacy didn't just erase the competition, they demonized them. The mother goddess Asherah, once called the Queen of Heaven, became an abomination. Bull, once a revered storm god, became the symbol of evil. Even serpents, symbols of knowledge and healing, were cursed. Why? Because every rival symbol represented independence, sexuality, fertility, or knowledge, things that empowered humans. Yahweh's reformation purged all that and replaced it with hierarchy, obedience, and purity codes. The system wasn't spiritual, it was political. You control a people by controlling their gods. You control their gods by controlling their story. And it's not just theology, it's geography. The temples, the mountains, the rituals, they're carbon copies of Mesopotamian models. The Ark of the Covenant? That's a portable version of an Anunnaki energy chamber, gold-lined, conductive, dangerous to touch, carried by priests using insulating rods. The cherubim on top? That's straight from Babylonian iconography, winged hybrids guarding divine technology. You think it's myth until you realize every culture describing their gods' machines uses the same imagery: wings, fire, light, and sound. The same blueprint, different branding. Yahweh's Ark wasn't a symbol, it was a device. Even the laws echo the Sumerian and Babylonian codes. Hammurabi's tablets came long before Moses, and the structure, commandments, punishments, divine justification, is almost identical. It's not divine download. It's legal plagiarism. The difference is, Yahweh's version ties law directly to worship. Break a law, and you don't just break order, you defy God. That's genius-level social engineering. You merge law enforcement with theology, and suddenly every disobedient act is a sin. That's how control evolves from visible chains into invisible guilt. And you want to talk about evidence of the Anunnaki fingerprints? Look at the obsession with genealogy, who begat who, which bloodline carries the covenant. That's not spirituality, that's tracking a project. It's data management in ancient language. The same pattern exists in the Anunnaki epics, bloodlines of pure descent, hybrid offspring, beings of mixed divine and human DNA. The Hebrew texts continue that theme, sons of God taking human women, creating Nephilim. That's not a moral story, it's a record of interference. The hybrids threatened the hierarchy, and the purge followed. Flood, reset, repeat. Same cycle. Different God name. The reason this connection matters isn't to disprove faith, it's to understand origin. Yahweh didn't emerge from nothing. He was carved out of the old world of sky kings and cosmic bureaucrats. The transition from polytheism to monotheism wasn't enlightenment, it was consolidation. The Anunnaki ruled by many names: Enlil, Enki, Marduk, Bull. Yahweh became the final face of that dynasty. When humans finally started writing the story, they forgot, or were forced to forget, that those gods once had bodies, territories, rivalries, and machines. The myth got sanitized, then sanctified. But you can still see the seams. You can trace it in ritual. Yahweh's early followers built altars on high places, mountaintops, just like the Anunnaki landing sites. Smoke offerings, animal blood, fire, incense, it's not symbolic, it's chemical. Every temple in the region was a station, a power node connecting heaven and earth. The ancient texts say the gods descended upon the mountain. Yahweh does the same. Sinai, Zion, Carmel, each a meeting point between the divine and the terrestrial. Same playbook. The difference is in branding. Yahweh calls it holiness, the Sumerians called it descent. And then there's the Ark narrative, the glory of the Lord that strikes people dead if they touch it, that emits light and sound, that must be carried by specific personnel wearing protective garments. That's not worship, that's containment protocol. You're looking at ancient technology described through pre-scientific language. The Anunnaki legends talk about tablets of destiny, tablets, objects that held codes of creation and law. Sound familiar? Tablets of stone. Commandments written by the hand of God, another mythic reformat of Mesopotamian tech. The stories people romanticize as a divine justice are filled with terror, domination, and raw violence. Yahweh's record isn't the story of a benevolent God saving mankind, it's the history of a ruler enforcing compliance through punishment and fear. You've been told those acts were righteous, but if you read them for what they are, it's a chronicle of control. Genocide, mass execution, total obedience, sacrifice, submission, it's all there. You just learn to call it holy. Look at the pattern. Every time humanity disobeys, Yahweh responds with annihilation. Whole cities wiped out. Entire bloodlines erased. Floods, plagues, fire, war. He's not correcting behavior, he's asserting dominance. This isn't moral teaching, it's enforcement through terror. The destruction of Sodom and Gomorrah isn't a morality tale, it's an intimidation tactic. The same script appears again and again: one God, one order, one warning, follow or perish. That's not spirituality. That's occupation. The psychological manipulation is brilliant. He builds fear into worship. People don't follow out of love, they follow out of survival. Fear of the Lord is the beginning of wisdom. That line alone tells you everything. It's conditioning. Once you make fear sacred, you never need chains again. People police themselves. And every time they question it, there's another story of divine punishment waiting to remind them: obedience equals life, doubt equals death. That's control engineering at its finest. Now, let's talk about the blood. Yahweh's entire system runs on it. Every covenant, every ritual, every blessing, sealed in blood. Sacrifices aren't symbolic, they're transactional. Life force for favor. The smell of burning flesh described as a pleasing aroma. You don't call that divine, you call that primitive energy exchange. These aren't rituals of devotion, they're fuel cycles. Every slaughter, every altar, every offering, feeding something that demanded constant sustenance. It's not morality, it's consumption. The God of mercy couldn't function without death. And he doesn't stop at animals. He tests humans with the ultimate offering, child sacrifice. Remember Abraham and Isaac. A test, they say. But what kind of being asks a man to kill his own son to prove loyalty? That's not love. That's a power test. That's psychological domination, forcing someone to choose obedience over instinct, faith over empathy. And when the knife is stopped, people call it mercy. But the trauma is already done. You've proven your fear outweighs your humanity. That's the point. Every empire uses fear to hold power. Yahweh institutionalized it. The Israelites marched into Canaan under divine command, slaughtering men, women, children, even animals, because the Lord ordered it. When you read those passages, you're not reading about spiritual purification. You're reading about conquest under religious justification. It's the same logic every tyrant uses: kill in the name of order. Destroy to preserve purity. The only difference is, Yahweh doesn't hide behind politics. He brands it as holiness. Now, here's where it gets even darker. Yahweh doesn't just punish humans, he manipulates them into punishing each other. He sets laws that pit tribes, families, even neighbors against one another. You disobey? Your entire household is cursed. Someone sins? The whole community pays. It's not individualized justice, it's collective fear. A system designed to make everyone monitor everyone else. That's how you build control that lasts generations. When fear becomes cultural, no one escapes it. Let's dissect how Yahweh's punishments always escalate. Disobedience starts small: a warning, a plague, a disaster, and ends in extermination. He doesn't correct behavior gradually, he nukes it from existence. When the Israelites complain in the desert, fire rains down. When they worship a golden calf, thousands are slaughtered. This isn't divine discipline. It's overkill. It's the mindset of an authoritarian being incapable of coexistence. You don't reason with Yahweh, you obey or you're erased. And notice how his anger operates. It's never proportional. It's absolute. Infinite rage for finite mistakes. That's not godly wrath, it's the psychology of an unstable ruler. Every act of defiance is treated as rebellion. Every question is blasphemy. Every rival deity is treason. That's not justice, that's paranoia. You're not dealing with omniscience, you're dealing with a celestial dictator who cannot tolerate challenge. The only acceptable world is total submission. The concept of holy war originates here. It's Yahweh who invents the framework: kill for faith, purge for purity, annihilate for obedience. And people followed it willingly because they were told they were chosen. That's the bait. Convince a group they're special, then weaponize them against everyone else. Chosen isn't privilege, it's recruitment. Yahweh's wars weren't divine missions, they were territorial operations. Every conquered land became holy the moment it was taken. That's propaganda dressed as revelation. Watch how he manipulates emotion. Yahweh doesn't inspire love, he demands it while threatening punishment. Love the Lord your God, or face destruction. That's not love, that's coercion. Love under duress isn't devotion, it's survival instinct. The entire emotional framework of the Old Testament is trauma bonding. He breaks them, saves them, punishes them, forgives them, over and over, until fear feels like safety. The cycle creates dependency. You can't imagine life without your captor because your captor is your God. And the irony is brutal. Every story that paints Yahweh as merciful comes right after he destroys everything. The flood, for example, wiping out the world, then calling it a fresh start. That's like burning down a house and claiming you renovated it. Mercy after mass destruction isn't mercy, it's damage control. He resets the board, repopulates his subjects, and calls it righteousness. But the pattern remains: obedience breeds reward, defiance breeds death. No growth, no freedom, just survival under threat. The punishment of Job exposes another layer. Here's a man who did everything right, yet Yahweh allows his suffering just to win an argument. That's not moral testing, it's cruelty disguised as demonstration. He destroys a man's life to prove loyalty, then restores it as if that erases the torment. That's the behavior of a being who sees humans as pawns in his game of power validation. Suffering isn't collateral, it's entertainment. And it gets stranger when you analyze Yahweh's obsession with vengeance. He admits it openly: vengeance is mine. That's not divine justice, that's personal pride. A being that claims ultimate power shouldn't need revenge. But Yahweh demands it constantly. He doesn't forgive, he retaliates. He doesn't redeem, he eradicates. Every offense, every insult, every rival nation met with fury and fire. That's not godhood, it's insecurity wearing a crown. Even his interactions with his prophets show the same pattern. They don't receive visions of peace, they receive warnings of destruction. Fire, famine, captivity. The so-called Word of God is a broadcast of threats. And when the prophets hesitate, he punishes them too. Jonah runs, he's swallowed alive. Moses doubts, he's denied the promised land. This isn't guidance, it's micromanagement through fear. No one speaks for Yahweh freely, they survive him. And don't overlook the ritualistic violence. The detailed laws of sacrifice read like a butcher's manual. Which organs to burn, how much blood to sprinkle, where to cut the animal. It's methodical, almost scientific. That level of precision isn't for symbolism, it's for efficiency. Every act feeding a system that required energy. The altar isn't a table, it's a machine. And the priests aren't spiritual leaders, they're technicians maintaining an ancient power protocol. You ever notice how Yahweh reacts when people try to approach him without permission? Instant death. Touch the ark, you die. Enter the Holy of Holies, you die. Look at him, you die. What kind of God kills his followers for proximity? That's not holiness, that's radiation. You're not unworthy, you're unshielded. The stories aren't spiritual metaphors, they're hazard reports written in religious language. Every encounter framed as divine wrath could just as easily be exposure to something beyond human tolerance. And what about the commandments that sound moral but function as control mechanisms? Honor me. Keep my day. Do not speak my name in vain. It's brand protection, not ethics. Every law reinforces hierarchy. The first half of the commandments isn't about human behavior, it's about loyalty enforcement. Only the last few touch human morality. That ratio tells you the real priority. The system wasn't designed to create virtue, it was built to maintain authority. The psychological depth of this domination is staggering. Yahweh doesn't just control through fear, he embeds guilt as a permanent mechanism. You're born wrong. You're unclean by default. Every human act needs purification. You start life in debt to a God who claims he made you defective. That's not divine design, it's control through shame. The more guilty you feel, the more obedient you become. And that guilt doesn't end, it's generational. The sins of the fathers will be visited upon the sons. Eternal debt passed through bloodline. That's systemic slavery disguised as spirituality. You've heard the story of Lucifer's rebellion, right? The cosmic traitor, the fallen one, the serpent. But what if I told you that story didn't start in heaven, it started on earth, and the roles were reversed? The so-called enemy wasn't evil. He was enlightened. He wasn't rebelling against creation, he was defying a corrupt administrator, Yahweh, the same being the ancients called Enlil, the Anunnaki overlord who wanted total control of humanity. And the being who tried to free us? That wasn't a devil. That was Enki, the serpent of knowledge. The one who broke ranks, who risked everything to give humanity awareness. That's where the real war began. Not between good and evil, but between control and liberation. The book of Genesis isn't a divine revelation, it's a censored report. Every line of it hides a power struggle between two factions of sky beings, Yahweh, the enforcer of law and submission, and Enki, the scientist and liberator. When you read the serpent tempting Eve, you're not reading about sin. You're watching an act of rebellion against an authoritarian God. Yahweh bans knowledge. Enki provides it. Yahweh punishes curiosity. Enki rewards it. Yahweh demands obedience. Enki offers awareness. So who's really the villain? The one who wants you ignorant, or the one who opens your eyes? Yahweh's anger in the garden makes sense only if you see him as a ruler losing control over his experiment. He created humans, kept them limited, and confined their awareness. The tree of knowledge wasn't mystical, it was data. Forbidden access. A firewall around human consciousness. When Enki, disguised as the serpent, overrode that restriction, humanity's software changed. Awareness activated. Consciousness expanded. And Yahweh panicked. He didn't say, "You have sinned." He said, "Behold, the man has become like one of us, knowing good and evil." That's not morality, that's hierarchy. He realized the humans were no longer controllable. The virus of awareness had infected his system. That single moment of defiance is the oldest act of rebellion in human myth, and Yahweh's response was brutal. Expulsion, suffering, subjugation. The birth of pain, labor, death, all punishments for accessing knowledge. That's not divine justice, that's a cover-up. He couldn't destroy the humans without destroying his own creation, so he rewrote the story. He turned the liberator into a serpent, the symbol of wisdom into a symbol of evil. Classic political move, demonize your rival, sanctify yourself. Every empire does it. The Anunnaki just did it first. Think about the serpent's role across civilizations. In Sumer, the serpent represents Enki, the god of water, creation, and knowledge. In Egypt, it's the Uraeus, the symbol of royal power and divine insight. In Greece, it's the staff of Asclepius, healing through wisdom. Only in Yahweh's world does the serpent become Satan. Why? Because the serpent disobeyed. Because it gave humanity power that Yahweh didn't authorize. The serpent wasn't the fall, it was the awakening. The moment the human race stopped being livestock and started being conscious beings. And Yahweh never forgave that. Every myth that followed, Cain and Abel, Babel, the flood, they're all versions of the same retaliation. Every time humanity evolves, Yahweh intervenes. He divides, destroys, resets. Because consciousness is the one thing he can't control. And who shows up again and again in these stories? The trickster, the rebel, the one bringing light or knowledge. Prometheus steals fire. Thoth brings wisdom. Lucifer brings illumination. It's the same archetype, different masks. The bringer of forbidden knowledge who gets punished by the jealous God. The story repeats because it's not fiction, it's a memory, encoded into myth, of that ancient schism between Yahweh and Enki. Let's break it down like a real investigation. Enlil, the High Anunnaki commander, represents order, authority, discipline, everything Yahweh embodies. Enki, his half-brother, represents intelligence, experimentation, evolution, everything Yahweh fears. The humans were Enki's creation. He designed them. But Enlil claimed ownership. He became their god. That's where the friction exploded. Enki wanted humans to learn, to grow, to join the ranks of the divine. Enlil, Yahweh, wanted them obedient, functional, productive. That wasn't a moral disagreement. That was a managerial crisis. Enki saw potential, Yahweh saw property. And when that property woke up, the war began. You can trace this conflict in every layer of scripture once you strip away the translation filters. Yahweh is always punishing humans for curiosity, eating forbidden fruit, building towers, mixing languages, creating tools, challenging nature. Every act of progress is treated as sin. Every expression of independence gets labeled rebellion. That's not holiness, it's suppression of evolution. And the serpent keeps coming back, over and over, whispering knowledge, offering tools, teaching alchemy, astronomy, agriculture. Those are Enki's fingerprints. The hidden hand of the rebel god still working through history, hiding in plain sight while Yahweh builds systems to erase him. The story of the Tower of Babel is a perfect example. Humans start building a structure to reach the heavens, a metaphor for enlightenment. Yahweh says, they will become like us. The same fear he expressed in Eden. So what does he do? Confuses their languages, scatters them, divides them. Classic containment. But look closer, the humans weren't trying to overthrow God, they were trying to join him. To ascend. To reunite with the source. Yahweh's reaction reveals his true nature, he's not threatened by evil, he's threatened by independence. Now, imagine the flood from this perspective. Yahweh claims humanity became corrupt. But what does corrupt mean in a control system? It means disobedient, independent, self-aware. But sons of God mating with daughters of men isn't sin, it's integration. The blending of divine and human bloodlines. Enki's doing. He was merging the two species. Yahweh calls it abomination because it breaks the boundaries he set. So he floods the world, wipes out the hybrids, and resets humanity to factory default. It's not moral cleansing, it's data purging. The flood wasn't judgment. It was reboot. And Enki, once again, defied him, saving Noah's bloodline, preserving the spark of knowledge that would rebuild civilization. That's the hidden thread connecting all ancient myths, the tension between those who wanted humanity to ascend and those who wanted it contained. Yahweh enforced vertical hierarchy. Enki pushed horizontal evolution. One ruled by command, the other by awakening. That's why, even in later religious texts, you find traces of this duality. The prophets talk about the word of the Lord, but the mystics talk about the voice within. One comes from fear, the other from awareness. two frequencies still battling for human consciousness. And the irony? The very God who punishes the serpent later performs the same role. Yahweh gives laws, reveals secrets, sends fire from heaven, actions indistinguishable from the forbidden powers he once condemned. He steals Enki's playbook and claims authorship. The rebel becomes the villain, and the tyrant becomes the teacher. History rewrote the crime scene. Every culture that followed inherited the edited version, the version where rebellion equals evil, obedience equals good. That's how you rewrite history to erase the liberator. You can even see how this rivalry influenced humanity's idea of good and evil itself. The entire moral structure of Western civilization is built on this flipped narrative: obedience glorified, curiosity condemned. That's not accidental. That's programming. Yahweh's system made humans associate enlightenment with sin and fear with virtue. Meanwhile, the archetype of the serpent kept surfacing under new names: Hermes, Lucifer, Prometheus, always the same message: you don't need permission to evolve. But Yahweh's system buried that message under dogma. The emotional charge of these stories isn't about faith, it's about power trauma. Humanity remembers being punished for learning. That's why every spiritual awakening feels like guilt, why every question feels like blasphemy. That's Yahweh's signature embedded in the collective psyche. The guilt isn't natural, it's inherited. The serpent didn't curse us. Yahweh programmed us to fear the very thing that could free us: knowledge. The war between Yahweh and Enki didn't end in myth, it metastasized into ideology. One side uses fear, law, and submission to maintain control, the other uses knowledge, science, and rebellion to awaken autonomy. Every culture, every empire, every religion that followed is a retelling of that same war. The labels changed: angels versus demons, light versus darkness, but the structure stayed the same. The Anunnaki just rebranded the factions. Yahweh's narrative became mainstream religion. Enki's narrative became forbidden law. Now, focus on the emotional pattern behind Yahweh's jealousy. He's not threatened by rival gods, he's threatened by rivals who empower humans. Every time a being shows up offering enlightenment, Yahweh calls it deception. Every act of self-realization becomes temptation. It's not because the knowledge is false, it's because knowledge makes humans harder to control. The serpent's sin was not lying, but it was telling the truth too early. And Yahweh's wrath was the response of a ruler whose subjects just discovered they were more than slaves. Let's talk about the one thing religion never wanted you to ask: why would a god need to create workers? The story of creation isn't divine inspiration, it's industrial design. The human race wasn't crafted out of love, it was manufactured for function. The so-called creation of man was a lab project, a genetic operation by a group of advanced beings known to the ancients as the Anunnaki, beings who engineered humans to serve, mine, and maintain the system they built on Earth. And the head of that operation, the one later rebranded as a god, was Yahweh. Strip away the poetry, and Genesis reads like a field manual. Let us make man in our image, after our likeness. Us, not me. That's a committee talking, a team of beings modifying a species. The image part isn't spiritual resemblance, it's biological patterning. They made us compatible, programmable, and dependent. And Yahweh wasn't the artist, he was the project manager. He didn't create life from nothing, he reproposed what already existed. The raw material was here. The spark came from somewhere else. That's why the first human is called Adam, from Adamu, the Sumerian term for worker or servant of the gods. That's not religion. That's production. The Anunnaki system needed labor. Mining gold, maintaining energy systems, building infrastructure, tasks too menial for divine rulers. So they engineered a hybrid, part earth creature, part divine DNA. The experiment worked, but the result was unstable, emotional, self-aware, unpredictable. Yahweh saw the danger immediately. A species capable of questioning its role doesn't stay obedient for long. So he limited lifespan, restricted knowledge, and installed hierarchy. Humans became functional but forgetful, smart enough to serve, not smart enough to rebel. That's not creation. That's containment. Look at how the Bible frames work itself. Labor isn't sacred, it's punishment. By the sweat of your brow you will eat your food. That's not a moral statement, it's a genetic memory of slavery. The Anunnaki designed humans to toil, and Yahweh encoded that in myth so no one would ever see it as oppression. Work became worship. Service became virtue. You weren't supposed to see yourself as labor, you were supposed to see yourself as faithful. It's the oldest rebrand in history, slave turned servant, servitude turned holiness. The flood narratives, the genealogies, the chosen bloodlines, all trace back to this project management system. The hybrids that deviated from the program were wiped out. The ones that stayed compliant became blessed. Noah wasn't righteous in a moral sense, he was genetically pure, uncorrupted by forbidden crossbreeding. The reset wasn't moral cleansing, it was quality control. The earth wasn't cleansed of sin, it was sterilized of mutation. Yahweh was maintaining his experiment, rebooting humanity when the DNA no longer matched the original blueprint. Even the concept of breath, the Spirit of God breathed into man, reads like an activation sequence. The word Ruach means wind, energy, force. The moment that energy entered the body, the hybrid woke up. That's not spiritual awakening, it's bioengineering. The so-called soul was the operating system. The body was the hardware. Yahweh was the engineer running code. And when you see humans as biological programs, the endless cycle of obedience, worship, and sacrifice suddenly makes perfect sense, it's feedback. Energy returned to its source. Every temple built, every altar raised, every prayer uttered, it's data transfer. A control signal looping back to the original designer. Ancient priests weren't just holy men, they were system operators. They performed the rituals, maintained the frequencies, ensured the energy output flowed where it needed to go. The language of pleasing aroma, sweet savor, and acceptable offering describe sensory and energetic responses, not divine emotions. It's calibration. When humans stopped offering, the system destabilized. Yahweh's anger wasn't rage, it was depletion. The grid needed input. Blood, sound, smoke, all forms of vibration. That's why the Old Testament God reacts physically. He doesn't manifest everywhere at once, he appears, descends, interacts. That's not omnipresence, that's limited range. You're dealing with a being bound by energy and location. The glory of the Lord descending on a mountain or temple wasn't metaphysical light, it was plasma discharge, the same phenomenon described in every ancient civilization when the gods landed. The technology was divine only because no one else understood it. And humanity's job wasn't to comprehend it, it was to fuel it. You can see the same pattern in the division of humanity into tribes, castes, and priesthoods. That wasn't social evolution, it was engineered hierarchy. Each level served a function. The workers harvested. The warriors protected. The priests mediated. And Yahweh ruled. It's the structure of a colony, not a family. And the laws given through prophets weren't moral innovations, they were behavioral protocols to maintain the experiment. Do not mix fabrics, do not eat certain animals, do not marry outside your tribe. Those aren't moral warnings, they're genetic segregation policies. They preserve the bloodline of the subjects closest to the original Anunnaki design. When you start viewing humanity through this lens, the entire narrative changes. Free will becomes a controlled variable. Sin becomes system malfunction. Salvation becomes system repair. The afterlife? That's recycling, souls repurposed for new biological vessels once the old ones fail. That's why ancient texts emphasize obedience even in death. The machine doesn't stop when you die, the cycle continues. You're rebooted, reassigned, redeployed. The illusion of freedom keeps you compliant. You serve the system even beyond the grave. Now, the question that burns, why gold? Why Earth? Why humans? Gold isn't just decoration. It's a perfect conductor, radiation shield, and energy stabilizer. The Anunnaki needed it for technology, atmosphere, and longevity. Mining it themselves was inefficient. So they made a species to do it. The first cities, Eridu, Uruk, Ur, weren't cultural centers, they were extraction sites. The Garden of Eden wasn't paradise, it was the prototype compound where the first workers were created, trained, and monitored. Yahweh wasn't walking through a garden for leisure, he was overseeing production. And when the workers ate from the tree, they weren't sinning, they were discovering autonomy. That moment jeopardized the project. Even the concept of dominion, let them rule over the earth, is misleading. Humanity wasn't granted power, it was assigned management. The Dominion Clause was an operational directive to maintain the resources for the gods. The animals, plants, minerals, all inventory. That's why the earliest myths describe humans as caretakers, not kings. You don't own the earth if you were made from its dirt, you manage it for those who did. The real giveaway lies in Yahweh's constant obsession with purity and contamination. Over and over, the text warns about defilement, impurity, and unclean things. That's not spiritual hygiene, it's genetic protectionism. Mixing species, bloodlines, or even cultural practices threatens the experiment's integrity. When he commands genocide against certain tribes, it's not about moral corruption, it's about genetic deviation. Those populations carried traces of rival Anunnaki factions. Wipe them out and the control stays centralized. It's not divine wrath, it's competitive dominance. And the deeper you dig, the more mechanical Yahweh's interactions become. His presence burns, blinds, kills. His angels act like drones, executing, reporting, scanning. The Ark of the Covenant behaves like a weaponized reactor. These aren't symbols. They're devices, ancient technology mistaken for miracles. Yahweh didn't command nature, he manipulated it. And humanity, standing in awe of thunder and fire, called it holy. They couldn't see the machine behind the myth. Notice the language of servitude built into creation itself. The Lord formed man from the dust of the ground. Dust, raw material. Not creation ex nihilo, construction from components. The process is hands-on, physical, deliberate. There's no poetry here, it's assembly. And the image of God idea functions like branding, a permanent psychological watermark. Every human carries the imprint of their creator, not as a soul, but as a system tag. That's why religious devotion feels instinctive, it's genetic memory, the coded loyalty embedded during the first design. Worship is not choice, it's programming. The entire dynamic between Yahweh and humanity reads like the relationship between an engineer and his prototype. When humans behave as intended, the project thrives. When they evolve beyond parameters, he resets. The flood, the plagues, the exiles, they're all corrective updates. Yahweh doesn't punish sin, he patches code. The commandments, the covenants, the rituals, they're firmware upgrades, keeping the system aligned to the original purpose. Humanity's tragedy is that it mistook control for care and maintenance for morality. Power never vanishes, it just changes names. The final act of the Yahweh Anunnaki agenda wasn't creation, rebellion, or even control. It was consolidation. The moment when one celestial ruler eliminated every rival, silenced every alternative god, and crowned himself the sole architect of reality. That's what monotheism really is, not spiritual truth, but the political endgame of an ancient power structure. The war of the gods ended not in battle, but in censorship. Yahweh didn't win because he was right. He won because he rewrote the record. Look closely at history. The old pantheons were crowded, sky fathers, earth mothers, serpent gods, star queens, moon priests. Then suddenly, all that vanished. Overnight, an entire cosmic ecosystem was compressed into one jealous, singular entity. I am the Lord, and there is no other. That's not enlightenment, that's monopoly. That's the voice of a ruler locking the system, deleting his competitors, and convincing the masses that diversity of divinity equals blasphemy. The divine internet was shut down, and Yahweh became the firewall. He didn't do it with swords, he did it with scripture. The texts were edited, merged, burned, purified. Everything that hinted at multiplicity, gone. The feminine erased. The serpent demonized. The liberators recast as villains. And in their place stood one God who demanded absolute loyalty. You shall have no other gods before me. Translation: the age of the council is over. The merger is complete. You're not talking to the source, you're talking to the CEO who absorbed every department. Religion became the corporate rebrand of cosmic conquest. Even the language tells on itself. El, Bull, Adonai, Shaddai, different names that once referred to separate entities, fused into one. The scribes didn't invent Yahweh, they standardized him. They took dozens of divine identities, flattened them into a single profile, and called it purity. And when you control the definition of purity, you control who's allowed to speak. Every temple of Asherah, every shrine of Inanna, every grove of the mother goddess was bulldozed. The divine feminine wasn't defeated in war, it was deleted from memory. The greatest cover-up in theological history wasn't hiding sin, it was hiding the goddess. That erasure wasn't moral, it was strategic. The feminine divine represented balance, intuition, emotion, creation without domination. But balance threatens hierarchies. You can't rule a population that honors equality between masculine and feminine energies. So Yahweh's system sterilized it. Eve becomes the sinner. Asherah becomes an idol. Wisdom becomes rebellion. Every feminine symbol is weaponized against itself. And the result? A culture permanently divorced from its intuitive half, conditioned to worship control while calling it faith. The temples that replaced the old ones were monuments of obedience. Every design element screamed hierarchy, an outer court for the masses, an inner sanctum for the chosen, and a holy of holies for one man once a year. That's not religion, it's architecture for power. You create distance, ritualize it, and call it holiness. The higher you climb, the fewer can join you. That's how spiritual oligarchies are built. And the priests became middle management, enforcing divine bureaucracy under Yahweh's brand. Obedience turned into currency. Sacrifice became taxation. Faith became compliance. When Yahweh's monotheism expanded, it didn't enlighten civilizations, it consumed them. Babylon, Egypt, Canaan, Greece, each absorbed, rewritten, filtered through Yahweh's narrative. Every rival god became a demon. Every alternative cosmology became heresy. Even the star gods of the older Anunnaki myths were rebranded as fallen angels, outcasts in a system that once celebrated them. Imagine erasing your competitors by turning them into villains in your own story. That's genius-level propaganda. And it worked for thousands of years because the story wasn't just told, it was enforced. Entire generations were born under a rewritten sky. The plural heavens became singular. The cosmic hierarchy shrank into a pyramid with Yahweh at the top and humanity crushed beneath. The idea of chosen people wasn't divine favoritism, it was corporate loyalty. A contract of exclusivity. Worship me and you're protected. Betray me and you're erased. That's not spirituality, it's monopoly enforcement. Every tribe that resisted was annihilated. Every belief system that offered alternatives was outlawed. Faith didn't spread, it colonized. And what's wild is how effective the rebranding was. People began defending their own domination. They carried Yahweh's logo proudly, fighting wars in his name, burning libraries, killing heretics, without ever realizing they were enforcing the very system that enslaved them. The genius of the Anunnaki plan was psychological. When you can make people guard their own chains, you don't need soldiers. You just need priests. The word of God became the weapon. Words control perception, and perception defines reality. By controlling language, law, scripture, liturgy, Yahweh controlled thought itself. Every translation, every revision tightened the system. The divine council became a host of angels. The rebellious gods became fallen. The watchers became demons. Every trace of the original cosmology was sanitized. Even the concept of heaven was transformed from a realm of many into a kingdom of one. The hierarchy became infinite but invisible. That's the perfect prison. You can't rebel against what you can't see. Notice how Yahweh's evolution mirrors empire. Polytheism was decentralized power, local gods, local authority, flexible worship. Monotheism mirrored central government, one law, one ruler, one system. It's not coincidence that as Yahweh's religion consolidated, human empires did too. Kings ruled under divine mandate because Yahweh ruled them. The God-king dynamic wasn't metaphorical, it was structural. Earth became a reflection of heaven's tyranny. The macrocosm of Yahweh's celestial throne mirrored the microcosm of political power on earth. Religion became the prototype of totalitarianism. Even prophecy got weaponized. The prophets weren't foretelling, they were reinforcing authority. Their visions always ended the same way: obey or perish. Every prediction of doom doubled as a reminder of who was in charge. And when Yahweh went silent, his priests filled the gap. They spoke for him, interpreted him, moneized him. You can't question a God who no longer speaks, you can only trust the ones who claim to hear him. That's the beauty of absence, it creates dependence. And when other belief systems tried to rise, Yahweh's network absorbed them. Christianity rebranded Yahweh as Father, Islam as an Allah, both inheriting his traits: control, law, exclusivity. The names changed, but the architecture stayed. Three branches of the same tree, rooted in the same soil of obedience. The Anunnaki structure survived every reformation because the blueprint was never theological, it was psychological. You don't need to believe in Yahweh to live inside his system. You just need to think in his hierarchy. Every ritual that survived, baptism, communion, prayer, functions like coded obedience. You kneel, you confess, you submit. The posture of worship is identical to the posture of surrender. Every motion reinforces hierarchy. Every repetition programs compliance. People think they're connecting with the divine, but they're reenacting an ancient pact of servitude disguised as devotion. The entire ritual economy runs on submission masked as spirituality. Even the concept of faith was redefined. In older systems, faith meant trust in the flow of life, in the balance of forces. Under Yahweh, faith means loyalty to authority. Doubt becomes treason. Questioning becomes sin. It's intellectual colonization, training people to equate curiosity with danger. The Anunnaki couldn't stop human evolution, but they found a way to domesticate it. They didn't chain the body, they captured the mind. Once you make obedience sacred, you don't need to enforce it. People police themselves. You can see the last traces of the older world buried beneath Yahweh's script. The symbols of duality, the serpent, the star, the wings, the cube, they all point to knowledge older than monotheism. But every time they surface, they get demonized. The cube becomes Saturn, the serpent becomes Satan, the light bearer becomes Lucifer. The old gods aren't gone, they are buried under Yahweh's propaganda machine, waiting for the few who can still read the symbols without fear. The irony is almost poetic. The entity that claimed to be the only God on earth ended up creating more division, more bloodshed, and more worship than any pantheon ever did. Not because of holiness, but because of branding. Yahweh's true genius wasn't in creation, it was in control. He turned belief into currency, obedience into worship, and domination into doctrine. Every system of modern power still follows that template: governments, corporations, religions, all reflections of that original hierarchy forged in the deserts of Mesopotamia. The story of Yahweh's transformation from one Anunnaki ruler into the one true God isn't theology, it's a case study in how myth becomes empire. The priests became programmers. The temples became control hubs. The commandments became code. Humanity didn't outgrow the gods, it internalized them. Yahweh's legacy isn't a religion, it's a mindset: one God, one truth, one order, no questions. The oldest monopoly in history disguised as enlightenment. And that, right there, is the real revelation, the transition from pantheon to prison, from gods to God, from creation to control. Yahweh didn't just erase his rivals, he erased the memory that there were ever rivals to begin with. And by doing that, he became the invisible architect of civilization's operating system, one command at a time, one scripture at a time, one generation at a time. Thank you for watching till the end, for diving this deep, for daring to listen past the noise. If you made it here, you didn't just hear the story, you saw the structure behind it. And that means you're already ahead of the program.